The morning sky over Arlington National Cemetery was painted in shades of gray and blue as thousands gathered to pay their final respects to Lieutenant General Marcus Webb. The year was 2247 and humanity had spread across the stars, building colonies on distant worlds and forging alliances with alien species that once seemed like nothing more than science fiction dreams. Marcus Webb had been at the forefront of that expansion. A brilliant military strategist who had saved countless lives during the brutal war against the Krell Empire, his tactical genius during the Battle of Proxima Station had become the stuff of legend, studied in military academies across a dozen worlds. Now he lay in a flag-draped coffin, surrounded by honor guards from Earth and 3 allied alien species, while dignitaries from across the galaxy stood in solemn silence. Officer Derek Hayes stood near the cemetery gates, arms crossed and jaw clenched as he watched the procession with barely concealed contempt. He had been assigned to traffic control, a simple job that required nothing more than directing vehicles and keeping the area secure. Derek was a 10-year veteran of the local police force, though his record was far from spotless. Over the past 5 years, 17 formal complaints had been filed against him, ranging from excessive force to harassment of citizens he deemed suspicious. His supervisors had shuffled him from precinct to precinct, hoping each transfer would solve the problem. But Derek's issues ran deeper than any administrative solution could reach. He had specifically requested this assignment, telling his sergeant he wanted to help with such an important event, though his true motivations were far less noble. As Derek watched the ceremony unfold, his eyes fixed on General Patricia Monroe, who stood at attention beside the coffin. She was Marcus Webb's chosen successor, a woman who had risen through the ranks through sheer brilliance and dedication. She wore her dress uniform with pride, medals gleaming in the pale sunlight, her bearing that of someone who had earned every accolade through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Derek felt his anger rising as he stared at her. In his mind, people like Monroe and Webb represented everything wrong with the modern military. He had spent countless hours on extremist websites and forums, absorbing propaganda that painted Earth's diverse military leadership as weak and corrupt. These sites claimed that humanity had lost its way, that the Galactic Coalition was diluting what it meant to be truly human, and that people in positions of power no longer represented real American values. The ceremony proceeded with military precision. Alien dignitaries from the Valorian Confederacy, a species of tall, crystalline beings who had fought alongside Webb at Proxima Station, stepped forward to place their traditional memorial stones at the base of the coffin. Their ambassador spoke in heavily accented English about honor and sacrifice, about how Marcus Webb had shown them that humanity deserved its place among the stars. Derek scoffed quietly to himself. He didn't trust aliens and couldn't understand why Earth had gotten so involved with other species. In his view, humans should focus on human problems and leave the rest of the galaxy alone. As the ceremony drew to a close, a convoy of black vehicles approached the cemetery gates. Derek's attention snapped to them immediately. He had been waiting for this moment, watching for any opportunity to assert his authority. The vehicles were clearly part of the funeral procession, flying small flags that indicated military personnel, but Derek saw something else. He saw a chance to make the statement he had been planning for weeks. Without radioing for clearance or checking with his supervisors, he stepped into the road and raised his hand, signaling the convoy to stop. The lead vehicle came to a halt just a few feet from him. Derek approached the driver's side window, his hand already moving toward his weapon in what he considered an intimidating gesture. The window lowered to reveal a young lieutenant who looked confused by the interruption. Before the lieutenant could speak, Derek demanded identification from everyone in the vehicle. His tone was aggressive and confrontational, nothing like the professional courtesy expected at such an event. The lieutenant tried to explain that they were part of the funeral detail, that the vehicles contained high-ranking officers who had served under General Webb, but Derek cut him off. He wanted to see identification from every passenger, and he wanted it now. The rear door of the vehicle opened and Admiral Karen Foster stepped out. She was commander of Earth's Fifth Fleet, one of the most powerful military formations in human space. She wore her full dress uniform, complete with the insignia that clearly marked her rank and position. Admiral Foster approached Derek calmly, her voice measured and professional as she asked what the problem was. Derek looked her up and down with obvious disdain before demanding to know what she was doing there. The Admiral explained patiently that she was attending the funeral of her former commanding officer, that all the proper credentials had been filed with security, and that Derek was interfering with an official military proceeding. Something in Admiral Foster's calm authority made Derek even angrier. He raised his voice, asking why someone like her was in charge of anything important. His body camera, standard issue for all officers, captured every word and gesture. Other vehicles in the convoy had stopped behind the first, and more officers began emerging, including Colonel James Peterson, a decorated veteran who had served beside Webb for over a decade. They all tried to reason with Derek to help him understand that he was making a serious mistake, but he refused to listen. In his mind, he was standing up to the corrupt establishment, showing these military elites that they couldn't just do whatever they wanted. The commotion drew attention from the funeral. General Monroe, who had just finished paying her final respects to her mentor and friend, heard raised voices near the gates. She excused herself from the alien dignitaries and walked toward the disturbance, followed by 2 members of her security detail. As she approached, she could see Derek gesturing wildly at Admiral Foster and Colonel Peterson, his voice growing louder and more aggressive with each passing moment. Monroe assessed the situation quickly, recognizing the signs of an officer who was dangerously out of control. She stepped forward and identified herself clearly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded fleets in battle. She told Derek that he needed to stand down immediately and return to his assigned post. Derek turned to face General Monroe, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Everything he hated, everything he feared about the changing world, stood before him in the form of this confident, accomplished woman. His hand moved to his service weapon, and in one smooth motion, he drew it from his holster and pointed it directly at Monroe's chest. The world seemed to freeze in that terrible moment, as Derek Hayes held his weapon pointed at General Patricia Monroe's chest. Dozens of cameras captured the scene from multiple angles, including surveillance drones hovering overhead, the body cameras of security personnel, and even the personal devices of funeral attendees who had turned to see what the commotion was about. Monroe stood perfectly still, her military training keeping her calm even as her mind raced through possible outcomes. She had faced enemy fire on 3 different worlds, had commanded ships through battles that should have been impossible to survive, but never had she expected to have a weapon pointed at her by a police officer at a funeral on her own home planet. Derek's finger rested on the trigger, and his hand trembled slightly, though whether from fear or rage even he couldn't say. He shouted at Monroe to get on the ground, to show him respect, his words tumbling out in a confused stream that revealed more about his mental state than any coherent threat could have. Admiral Foster tried to step forward, her hands raised in a calming gesture, but Derek swung the weapon toward her and screamed at everyone to stay back. Colonel Peterson moved slowly to position himself between Derek and the crowd of funeral attendees, many of whom were civilians or foreign dignitaries who should never have been exposed to such danger. General Monroe's security detail reacted within seconds of Derek drawing his weapon. 2 agents moved to flank him while another positioned herself to shield Monroe if shooting started. They didn't draw their own weapons immediately because the situation was too volatile. Too many innocent people stood too close, and one wrong move could turn a tense standoff into a massacre. The lead agent, a woman named Helen Cruz who had protected Monroe for 3 years, spoke in a calm but firm voice. She told Derek that he was surrounded, that he needed to lower his weapon immediately, and that this situation could still end peacefully if he made the right choice. Derek responded by pressing the weapon forward, his aim never wavering from Monroe's center mass. In the crowd of funeral attendees, the alien dignitaries watched with a mixture of horror and confusion. The Valorian ambassador, a being named Kelthris whose crystalline body shifted through colors that reflected emotional states, had turned a deep red that his species associated with shock and disgust. Kelthris had fought alongside Marcus Webb during the darkest days of the Krell War and had seen the general lead humans and aliens together in perfect unity. To watch one human threaten another at Webb's funeral felt like a desecration of everything the general had stood for. Other alien observers began recording the incident on their own devices, knowing that this moment would have implications far beyond Earth's atmosphere. Derek continued shouting, his complaints growing more specific and more damning with each word. He ranted about the military taking over everything, about people who didn't belong in positions of power, about how things used to be better before Earth joined the Galactic Coalition. His body camera captured every syllable, creating a permanent record of his motivations and state of mind. Admiral Foster tried once more to reason with him, explaining that they were all on the same side, that they all served Earth and humanity, but Derek was beyond reason. He had convinced himself that this moment was necessary, that someone had to take a stand against what he saw as corruption and decline. The standoff had now lasted almost 2 minutes, though it felt like hours to everyone involved. More security forces arrived from different parts of the cemetery, creating a perimeter that kept civilians at a safe distance, while trained personnel moved into position. A hostage negotiator named Vincent Clark approached slowly, his hands clearly visible and his voice carefully modulated to sound non-threatening. Vincent had talked down armed suspects dozens of times in his career, but never in such a high-profile situation with so many witnesses and such enormous stakes. He introduced himself to Derek and asked what the officer needed, trying to establish some kind of dialogue that might lead to de-escalation. Derek's response was to push the weapon even closer to Monroe, near enough now that she could see his finger twitching on the trigger. She knew weapons intimately, had trained with everything from sidearms to ship-mounted railguns, and she recognized that Derek's pistol had no safety engaged. One nervous spasm and she would be dead. Monroe made a decision in that moment. She spoke directly to Derek, her voice steady and clear. She told him that she understood he was angry, that change could be frightening, but that pointing a weapon at her wouldn't solve anything. She explained that Marcus Webb, the man they were there to honor, had believed in bringing people together rather than tearing them apart. She asked Derek to think about what Webb would say if he could see this moment. For just a second, something shifted in Derek's expression. Perhaps Monroe's words reached some part of him that wasn't consumed by hate and fear. Perhaps he realized how badly he had miscalculated. But before that moment could develop into anything meaningful, his training as a police officer reasserted itself in the worst possible way. He had been taught to control situations, to never back down, to show strength in the face of challenges. In his twisted understanding, lowering his weapon now would be admitting defeat. So instead he doubled down, shouting at Monroe that she didn't get to tell him what to do, that he was the law here, that she needed to respect his authority. The Valorian ambassador Kelthris stepped forward then, his translator device converting his crystalline chiming into English words. He spoke about the sanctity of funeral rites across all civilized species, about how threatening violence at such an event was considered among the gravest of sins in Valorian culture. He said that Marcus Webb deserved better than this, that humanity deserved better than this, and that Derek was bringing shame upon his entire species. The ambassador's words carried weight, not just because of his position, but because of the genuine grief and disappointment in his synthesized voice. Kelthris had believed in humanity's potential, and Derek was forcing him to question that belief. Derek turned his head slightly to look at the alien ambassador, and that small movement gave the security team the opening they needed. Helen Cruz moved with practiced precision, stepping inside Derek's arm while simultaneously sweeping his weapon away from Monroe. Another agent grabbed Derek's wrist and applied a joint lock that made his fingers spasm open, releasing the pistol. Within 3 seconds, Derek was face down on the pavement, with his hands cuffed behind his back while security personnel secured his weapon and checked him for additional threats. He struggled and screamed the entire time, hurling insults and accusations, but it was over. The immediate danger had passed. General Monroe stood exactly where she had been throughout the entire incident, barely allowing herself to breathe now that the weapon was no longer pointed at her. Admiral Foster moved to her side, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder as they both processed what had just happened. Colonel Peterson retrieved Derek's weapon, checking to ensure it was safe before handing it to the lead investigator, who was already on scene. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 4 minutes from the moment Derek drew his weapon to the moment he was subdued. But those 4 minutes would change everything. Within 30 minutes of Derek Hayes being subdued and arrested, the first news reports began spreading across Earth and the colonies. By the time he was processed into custody at the federal holding facility, the incident had become the top story on every major network spanning human space. Video footage from dozens of sources flooded social media and news feeds, showing from multiple angles the moment a police officer drew his weapon on a general during a state funeral. The Galactic News Network, which broadcast to 17 species across 42 star systems, ran the story with the headline that a human law enforcement officer had threatened violence at a memorial ceremony attended by interstellar dignitaries. For humanity's carefully cultivated reputation as a mature and unified species, the timing couldn't have been worse. The investigation began immediately under the joint authority of the Military Justice Department and the Interstellar Relations Bureau. Special Agent Carmen White was assigned as lead investigator, a veteran of both military intelligence and civilian law enforcement, who had handled sensitive cases involving Earth's relationship with alien powers. Carmen's first action was to secure all video evidence from the scene, including Derek's body camera footage, which would prove crucial to understanding his actions and motivations. What that footage revealed was even more damning than the external videos had shown. Derek's camera had recorded his entire shift, including the moments before the funeral when he had muttered to himself about making a statement, and showing these people they couldn't just do whatever they wanted. Carmen's team began digging into Derek's background with thoroughness that left no detail unexplored. They pulled his personnel file from the police department and found a troubling pattern that should have raised red flags years earlier. 17 formal complaints over 5 years told a story of an officer who had lost his way, if indeed he had ever been on the right path. The complaints ranged from verbal harassment of minority citizens to excessive force during routine traffic stops. Multiple complainants had specifically mentioned that Derek seemed to target them based on their appearance or background, though previous investigators had always found ways to dismiss these concerns as misunderstandings or exaggerations. The digital forensics team uncovered a treasure trove of evidence when they examined Derek's personal devices and computer. His search history revealed years of visiting extremist websites that promoted conspiracy theories about the military and government. He had been active on forums where users discussed their belief that Earth's integration into the Galactic Coalition was a mistake, that diversity in leadership positions weakened humanity, and that true patriots needed to take action against what they saw as corruption. Derek had posted hundreds of messages under various usernames, each one revealing his growing radicalization and anger. In one particularly disturbing thread from 2 months before the funeral, Derek had written about wanting to do something that would make people pay attention, something that would show the world that not everyone agreed with the current direction of human civilization. His text messages and private communications painted an even clearer picture. Derek had been in contact with several other individuals who shared his extremist views, including 2 former police officers who had been dismissed for similar complaints of bias and misconduct. These messages showed careful planning in the weeks leading up to the funeral. Derek had specifically requested the cemetery assignment from his supervisor, claiming he wanted to pay respects to a fallen hero, when in reality he had been looking for an opportunity to make his statement. His messages revealed that he had initially considered simply disrupting the ceremony, but had eventually settled on the idea of confronting military leadership directly. The gun had always been part of his plan. Carmen interviewed Derek's co-workers and supervisors, building a profile of a man who had been falling apart for years while his department looked the other way. Fellow officers described Derek as increasingly isolated and angry, someone who ranted about politics and complained constantly about changes in society. Several admitted they had been uncomfortable around him, but hadn't reported their concerns because he was still doing his job most of the time. His sergeant, a man named Victor Stone, broke down during his interview and admitted that he had known Derek was troubled but had hoped that keeping him busy with routine assignments would prevent any serious incidents. Victor had to live now with the knowledge that his inaction had nearly resulted in a general being shot at a funeral. The Interstellar Relations Bureau focused on the diplomatic implications of Derek's actions. Ambassador Kelthris from the Valorian Confederacy filed a formal protest with Earth's government, expressing deep concern about what the incident revealed about human society. Kelthris had been personally close to Marcus Webb and felt betrayed that humans could dishonor their own hero in such a manner. The Valorian culture placed enormous importance on funeral rites and viewed any disruption of such ceremonies as a profound moral failing. Other alien species that had representatives at the funeral also filed inquiries, asking for explanations and assurances that such incidents were rare aberrations rather than symptoms of deeper problems in human civilization. The investigation team discovered that this wasn't the first time Derek had displayed concerning behavior around military personnel. 3 years earlier, he had stopped a Navy officer for a minor traffic violation and had spent 20 minutes lecturing the officer about wasted tax dollars and military overreach. The officer had filed a complaint, but it had been dismissed as a personality conflict. A year after that, Derek had been involved in a confrontation outside a veterans center, where he had accused former soldiers of being brainwashed by government propaganda. That incident had resulted in a written reprimand but no serious consequences. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. But Derek had been allowed to continue working because addressing the problem would have been difficult and uncomfortable. Carmen's team also investigated whether Derek had any accomplices or if he was part of a larger conspiracy. They found that while Derek had been in contact with other extremists, the decision to draw his weapon at the funeral had been his alone. His online associates had encouraged his rhetoric, but seemed shocked when they learned what he had actually done. Several of them deleted their accounts and went silent, fearing they might be implicated in Derek's actions. The investigation concluded that Derek was a lone actor, radicalized by online propaganda but ultimately responsible for his own choices. The physical evidence from the scene was processed with meticulous care. Derek's service weapon was examined and found to be fully loaded with 1 round in the chamber, and the safety disengaged. Ballistics experts testified that the weapon had been ready to fire, and that only Derek's decision not to pull the trigger had prevented a tragedy. The distance between Derek and General Monroe at the closest point had been less than 2 meters, near enough that even a poorly aimed shot would likely have been fatal. Crime scene reconstruction showed that if Derek had fired, the bullet's trajectory would have passed through a crowd that included not only Monroe, but also 3 civilian funeral attendees and 2 alien dignitaries. As the investigation progressed, public opinion on Earth and across the colonies turned strongly against Derek. Initial attempts by some extremist groups to paint him as a hero or a victim quickly faded when the full evidence became public. Even people who had concerns about military influence or Earth's role in the Galactic Coalition couldn't defend pointing a weapon at someone during a funeral. The video footage was too clear, Derek's own words too damning, and the context too indefensible. Protests erupted in several cities demanding accountability, not just for Derek but for the police department that had enabled him and the system that had allowed his complaints to be ignored for so long. Carmen White compiled her final report after 3 weeks of intensive investigation. The report ran to over 300 pages and included testimony from 47 witnesses, analysis of hundreds of hours of video footage, and detailed examination of Derek's communications and history. The conclusion was unambiguous in stating that Derek Hayes had deliberately and with premeditation confronted General Patricia Monroe at Lieutenant General Marcus Webb's funeral and had drawn his weapon with intent to threaten and potentially harm her. The report recommended that Derek be prosecuted to the fullest extent of military and civilian law, and that his actions be treated as the serious crime they represented. The trial of Derek Hayes began on a cold November morning at the Federal Military Court in Washington. The courthouse had been built in the early days of Earth's expansion into space and had hosted some of the most significant legal proceedings in modern human history, but never had it seen such intense public interest. News crews from every major network filled the designated media area, while hundreds of spectators lined up hoping for one of the limited public gallery seats. Security was unprecedented, with military police, federal agents, and even a discreet detail of alien observers, ensuring that nothing disrupted the proceedings. The trial would be broadcast live across human space and transmitted to allied alien governments, making it perhaps the most watched legal event in galactic history. Derek sat at the defense table wearing a plain suit instead of his police uniform, which had been stripped from him the day of his arrest. His attorney, Linda Grant, sat beside him, reviewing notes and trying not to show how impossible she knew her job would be. Linda was a public defender with 15 years of experience, someone who believed deeply in the right to a fair trial even for the most unsympathetic defendants. But Derek tested even her professional dedication. He had refused to show any remorse during their meetings, insisting that he had been doing his duty and that everyone would eventually understand he had been right. Linda had tried to explain that such an attitude would only hurt his case, but Derek dismissed her concerns with the same arrogance that had led him to draw his weapon in the first place. The prosecution team was led by Commander Alan Price, a military attorney who had built his career on handling complex cases involving interstellar law and military justice. Alan had personally requested this assignment because he had served under Marcus Webb early in his career and felt a deep obligation to ensure that the general's funeral would not be remembered only for Derek's actions. Sitting beside Alan were two civilian prosecutors from the Justice Department, creating a joint team that reflected the dual nature of Derek's crimes as violations of both military and civilian law. The charges against Derek were severe, including assault with a deadly weapon on a military officer, attempted murder, threatening an interstellar peace officer, and violations of the Unified Earth Criminal Code that governed interactions between humans and allied species. Judge Colonel Richard Barnes entered the courtroom, and everyone rose. Barnes was a veteran of 30 years in military justice, known for running a fair but strict courtroom. He had reviewed the evidence in pre-trial hearings and understood the gravity of what he was about to oversee. After everyone was seated, Barnes addressed the court and explained that this trial would proceed according to law and evidence, that emotion and public opinion would have no place in his courtroom, and that both sides would be given every opportunity to present their case. He then asked the prosecution to present their opening statement. Commander Price stood and approached the jury. 12 citizens drawn from across Earth, and the colonies who had been screened carefully to ensure they could judge the case fairly, despite the massive publicity. Price spoke clearly and without theatrics as he laid out what the prosecution intended to prove. He described Derek Hayes as a police officer who had abused his authority, who had allowed personal prejudice to guide his actions, and who had ultimately committed a violent crime at one of the most solemn occasions in military tradition. Price told the jury that they would see video evidence from multiple angles, that they would hear testimony from numerous witnesses, and that the facts would show beyond any doubt that Derek had acted deliberately and without justification. He emphasized that this wasn't just about one man's crimes, but about whether society would tolerate those who wore badges, using them as shields for hatred and violence. Linda Grant stood for the defense, opening and did her best with an impossible situation. She acknowledged that Derek had drawn his weapon, but asked the jury to consider his state of mind, the stress of his job, and the confusion of the moment. She tried to paint Derek as someone who had made a terrible mistake rather than someone who had acted with criminal intent. Grant suggested that Derek had felt threatened by the crowd of military personnel, that he had been trying to maintain order, and that he had panicked when the situation escalated beyond his control. Even as she spoke these words, Linda knew how hollow they sounded, but she was duty-bound to provide Derek with the best defense possible, even if that defense was weak. The prosecution began presenting evidence methodically and devastatingly. They started with video footage from the security drones that had captured the entire incident from overhead. The jury watched in silence as Derek confronted Admiral Foster, as General Monroe approached to de-escalate, and as Derek drew his weapon and pointed it directly at Monroe's chest. The footage was crystal clear, showing every detail including Derek's body language and facial expressions. There was no ambiguity, no moment of confusion that might suggest he had acted in self-defense or panic. The video showed a man who was angry and deliberate, who had chosen to draw his weapon in a calculated attempt to assert dominance. Commander Price then introduced Derek's body camera footage, which proved even more damaging. The jury heard Derek's muttered comments before the funeral about making a statement and showing people they couldn't do whatever they wanted. They heard his aggressive tone when he stopped Admiral Foster's vehicle, his refusal to accept reasonable explanations, and his escalating hostility toward military personnel. Most damning were Derek's own words as he pointed the weapon at General Monroe, his rant about the military and people who didn't belong in power, his explicit admission that he had wanted this confrontation. The body camera had created an irrefutable record of Derek's state of mind and intentions. The prosecution called its first witness, Helen Cruz, the security agent who had ultimately disarmed Derek. Helen testified about her observations during the incident, describing how Derek had ignored all attempts at de-escalation and had maintained his aim on General Monroe for nearly 4 minutes. She explained her training in threat assessment and stated professionally that Derek had exhibited all the signs of someone prepared to use lethal force. Under cross-examination, Linda Grant tried to suggest that Helen might have misread the situation, that perhaps Derek had been less threatening than he appeared, but Helen's testimony remained unshaken. She had protected General Monroe for 3 years and knew genuine threats when she saw them. Admiral Karen Foster took the stand next and recounted her perspective on the incident. She described attending Marcus Webb's funeral to honor a man she had served with for decades, only to be stopped and harassed by Derek Hayes. Foster testified that she had immediately recognized Derek's behavior as inappropriate and had tried to resolve the situation calmly. She spoke about the moment Derek drew his weapon, how she had feared not just for General Monroe but for all the civilians and dignitaries nearby. Admiral Foster's testimony was particularly powerful because of her composure and credibility. A decorated officer with an impeccable service record describing being threatened by someone who should have been there to protect and serve. Colonel James Peterson followed Admiral Foster to the stand. He had been standing near Derek when the weapon was drawn and testified about the immediate danger everyone had faced. Peterson described Derek's finger on the trigger, the safety disengaged, and the small distance between the weapon and General Monroe. He explained that in his combat experience he had seen that look in Derek's eyes before, the look of someone who had made a decision to use violence and was only waiting for an excuse. Linda Grant objected to this characterization as speculative, but Judge Barnes allowed it as expert opinion based on Peterson's extensive military background. The prosecution then called technical experts who analyzed the video footage frame by frame. They showed the jury exactly how Derek's weapon had been positioned, calculated the precise distance and angle, and demonstrated that Derek would have had a clear shot if he had chosen to fire. Ballistics experts testified about the capabilities of Derek's service weapon and confirmed that at that range, a shot to the torso would almost certainly have been fatal, even with immediate medical attention. Medical examiners explained what the bullet would have done to human tissue, making the potential consequences of Derek's actions horrifyingly real for the jury. As the first week of trial concluded, the prosecution had built an overwhelming case based purely on objective evidence and expert testimony, but they were far from finished. The second week of trial began with Linda Grant attempting to present a defense based on Derek's state of mind and character. She had warned Derek that this strategy was risky, that bringing character witnesses might backfire if the prosecution exposed their biases, but Derek had insisted that people needed to hear from those who supported him. Linda had no choice but to proceed with the plan and hope for the best, though her instincts told her this would end badly. The first defense witness was Gregory Palmer, a fellow police officer who had worked with Derek for 6 years. Gregory took the stand and testified that Derek had always been a dedicated officer who cared about public safety and took his job seriously. Commander Price rose for cross-examination with a folder of documents in his hand. He asked Gregory if he was aware of the 17 complaints filed against Derek over 5 years. Gregory admitted he knew about some of them, but claimed they were exaggerated or taken out of context. Price then asked if Gregory shared Derek's views about the military and Earth's role in the Galactic Coalition. Gregory hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question before admitting that he thought the military had too much influence in civilian affairs. Price pressed further, asking if Gregory had ever heard Derek make disparaging comments about military personnel based on their background or appearance. After a long pause, Gregory admitted that Derek sometimes complained about diversity initiatives and political correctness, but insisted this was just normal. Frustration that many officers felt. The prosecution then presented chat logs between Gregory and Derek where both men had shared extremist articles and complained about what they called the decline of traditional values. Gregory's credibility as a character witness evaporated as the jury saw evidence that he shared many of Derek's problematic views. When Linda tried to rehabilitate her witness on redirect examination, Gregory only made things worse by defending some of the extremist content, claiming it raised legitimate concerns. Judge Barnes had to remind the jury that Gregory Palmer was not on trial, but the damage to Derek's defense was already done. If these were the people who thought Derek was a good officer, what did that say about Derek himself? Linda's next witness was Derek's former supervisor, Victor Stone, who she hoped would testify that Derek had been under significant work stress that might explain his behavior. Victor took the stand looking deeply uncomfortable, clearly wrestling with guilt over his role in enabling Derek. Under Linda's questioning, Victor described the pressures police officers faced, the long hours and difficult situations, and suggested that Derek might have reached a breaking point. But when Commander Price cross-examined him, Victor fell apart. Price asked directly if Victor had known about Derek's extremist views and history of complaints. Victor admitted that yes, he had known, and yes, he probably should have done more to address the problems earlier. He confessed that he had transferred Derek to different assignments hoping to avoid confrontation rather than dealing with the underlying issues. Commander Price showed no mercy in his questioning. He asked Victor if he understood that his failure to act had put General Monroe's life in danger. He asked if Victor felt any responsibility for the international incident that had resulted from Derek's actions. Victor broke down on the stand, his voice cracking as he admitted that he would have to live with his failures for the rest of his life. The testimony that was supposed to help Derek's case instead became a powerful statement about institutional failure and the consequences of looking the other way when officers showed signs of dangerous behavior. Linda objected several times to the prosecution's questioning as outside the scope, but Judge Barnes overruled most objections, noting that Victor's knowledge of Derek's history was directly relevant to understanding the defendant's pattern of behavior. The defense called a psychologist named Dr. Kenneth Miller who had evaluated Derek after his arrest. Dr. Miller testified that Derek showed signs of stress and anxiety, conditions that might have impaired his judgment during the confrontation at the funeral. Linda hoped this testimony would support an argument that Derek had not been thinking clearly, and therefore lacked the intent necessary for the most serious charges. However, Commander Price's cross-examination demolished this theory. Price presented Dr. Miller with Derek's online posts and messages from the weeks before the funeral, asking the psychologist to evaluate whether someone planning a confrontation and talking about making a statement could claim to have been acting on impulse in the moment. Dr. Miller had to admit that the evidence suggested premeditation rather than a stress-induced lapse in judgment. Price then called his own psychological expert, Dr. Rachel Kim, a specialist in radicalization and extremist behavior. Dr. Kim had reviewed all of Derek's communications and online activity, and she painted a disturbing picture of a man who had spent years consuming propaganda that dehumanized certain groups and glorified violent resistance to authority he disagreed with. She testified that Derek's actions at the funeral were entirely consistent with his pattern of radicalization, that he had been building toward some kind of confrontation, and that his decision to draw his weapon was not a momentary aberration, but the culmination of years of extremist thinking. Dr. Kim explained that people like Derek often convinced themselves they were patriots or heroes, which made them especially dangerous because they felt morally justified in actions that any reasonable person would recognize as wrong. Linda Grant attempted to call character witnesses from Derek's personal life, including a cousin and a former neighbor, but their testimony did little to help. Both acknowledged that Derek had become increasingly angry and isolated in recent years. Both admitted they had been concerned about some of his views, but hadn't known how serious the problem was. The prosecution used these witnesses to reinforce their narrative that Derek's crime wasn't a surprise but rather a predictable outcome of unchecked radicalization that multiple people had noticed but no one had adequately addressed. Every witness Linda called seemed to provide more evidence for the prosecution than for the defense. The prosecution then presented devastating evidence about Derek's planning and intent. Digital forensics expert Danny Wright took the stand and walked the jury through Derek's online activity in the months before the funeral. Danny showed posts where Derek had discussed wanting to take action, messages where he had requested the cemetery assignment, and searches for information about funeral security protocols. The evidence painted a clear picture of someone who had been planning a confrontation, not someone who had simply lost control in a stressful moment. Danny testified that Derek had deleted some of his online posts in the days before the funeral, suggesting he knew his views might be problematic if discovered, but that forensic recovery had retrieved the deleted material. Commander Price called Special Agent Carmen White, who had led the investigation, to testify about what she had uncovered. Carmen methodically described the pattern of complaints against Derek, his connections to extremist groups, and the evidence that he had specifically targeted military personnel for harassment over the years. She testified that, in her professional opinion, Derek had committed a premeditated act when he drew his weapon on General Monroe, that every piece of evidence supported this conclusion, and that the claim of acting in self-defense or under stress was contradicted by Derek's own words and actions. Linda's cross-examination of Carmen was brief and ineffective, as the agent's testimony was backed by hundreds of pages of documented evidence. The most damaging moment for the defense came when the prosecution introduced testimony from Kyle Sanders, one of Derek's online contacts from an extremist forum. Kyle had been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation, and he revealed conversations where Derek had discussed making a big statement that would get people's attention. Kyle testified that Derek had become frustrated that online activism wasn't changing anything, and that he needed to do something more dramatic. When Derek had messaged Kyle the day after the funeral from jail, he hadn't expressed remorse but rather satisfaction that everyone was finally talking about the issues he cared about. This testimony destroyed any remaining possibility that Derek could claim his actions were unintentional, or that he now regretted them. Linda Grant made a strategic decision not to call Derek himself to testify. She knew that if Derek took the stand, Commander Price would destroy him on cross-examination. Derek's lack of remorse, his extremist views, and his tendency to double down on his positions when challenged would only convince the jury of his guilt more thoroughly. However, this decision meant the jury never heard Derek's side of the story directly, leaving them with only the prosecution's narrative and the devastating evidence that supported it. Linda delivered a closing argument that asked the jury to consider whether Derek's punishment should account for his stress and mental state, but even she sounded unconvinced by her own words. The defense had collapsed completely, undone by overwhelming evidence and witnesses who hurt rather than helped Derek's case. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, everyone in the courtroom knew which way the verdict would go. Commander Alan Price stood before the jury to deliver his closing argument on a gray afternoon in late November. The courtroom was packed with observers who had waited hours for seats, while millions more watched the live broadcast across human space and beyond. Price had spent 3 weeks methodically building a case that left no room for doubt, and now he would tie together all the evidence into a final statement that would guide the jury toward their verdict. He began by reminding them of why they were there, describing the scene at Arlington National Cemetery, where thousands had gathered to honor Lieutenant General Marcus Webb, a hero who had given his life in service to humanity and its allies. Price spoke about the sanctity of that moment, the dignity it deserved, and how Derek Hayes had violated both with his violent actions. Price walked the jury through the evidence piece by piece, starting with the video footage that showed Derek's deliberate confrontation with Admiral Foster and Colonel Peterson. He reminded them of Derek's body camera audio, where his true intentions were revealed in his own words. Price emphasized that this was not a case of misunderstanding or split-second decision-making, but rather a premeditated act by a man who had spent years nurturing hatred and resentment. He showed the jury excerpts from Derek's online posts and messages, making it clear that Derek had been planning some kind of confrontation and had seen the funeral as his opportunity. Price's voice grew stronger as he described the moment Derek drew his weapon and pointed it at General Monroe, noting that 47 witnesses had watched it happen and that cameras from 6 different angles had recorded it. The prosecutor addressed each charge individually, explaining how the evidence proved Derek's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. For the assault charge, Price noted that Derek had pointed a loaded weapon at Monroe from close range with his finger on the trigger. For attempted murder, he emphasized that Derek had maintained that threatening position for nearly 4 minutes, showing sustained intent to harm. For threatening an interstellar peace officer, Price reminded the jury that Monroe's role as a general put her under special protection due to Earth's treaty obligations with allied species. For violations of the Unified Earth Criminal Code, he explained that Derek's actions at a diplomatic event attended by alien dignitaries had damaged humanity's reputation and could have triggered an interstellar incident. Price concluded by asking the jury to consider what kind of society they wanted to live in, whether they would tolerate those who used badges and authority as cover for hatred and violence. Linda Grant rose for the defense closing argument, knowing she faced an impossible task. She began by acknowledging the seriousness of Derek's actions, but asked the jury to consider whether those actions rose to the level of the charges he faced. Grant suggested that while Derek had clearly made terrible choices, the question was whether he had acted with the criminal intent necessary for conviction on the most serious charges. She pointed to the stress police officers face daily, the split-second decisions they must make, and the possibility that Derek had been overwhelmed by circumstances he couldn't properly control. Grant reminded the jury that Derek had not actually fired his weapon, suggesting this showed he had retained some restraint even in a highly charged moment. Commander Price stood for his rebuttal and systematically dismantled Linda's arguments. He noted that Derek's own messages proved premeditation, that stress did not excuse drawing a weapon on an unarmed person at a funeral, and that choosing not to fire after pointing a gun at someone for 4 minutes was not evidence of restraint, but rather evidence that Derek had wanted to threaten and terrify rather than immediately kill. Price reminded the jury that attempted murder did not require a shot to be fired, only the intent to kill and a substantial step toward carrying it out. He emphasized that Derek's failure to pull the trigger might have been due to the security presence, not any moral restraint on Derek's part. Price sat down after a devastating rebuttal that left the defense with nothing to stand on. Judge Colonel Barnes instructed the jury on the law, explaining each charge and the standards they must apply. He reminded them that their job was to determine facts based on evidence, not emotion or sympathy. He explained the concept of reasonable doubt and emphasized that the prosecution bore the burden of proving every element of every charge beyond that standard. Barnes told the jury to consider each charge separately and to base their verdict solely on what they had seen and heard in the courtroom. After nearly an hour of detailed instructions, the jury was escorted to the deliberation room to begin their work. It was 3 p.m. when they left the courtroom. The waiting began. Reporters speculated about how long deliberations might take, with some suggesting it could be days given the complexity of the charges and the volume of evidence. Legal analysts debated on news programs about the strongest and weakest elements of each side's case, though most agreed the prosecution had presented an overwhelming argument for conviction. In the courthouse, General Monroe sat in a witness waiting room, finally allowing herself to process the trauma of having a weapon pointed at her. Admiral Foster and Colonel Peterson stayed with her, old friends providing support as they waited to learn whether justice would be served. Derek sat in a holding cell refusing to speak to Linda Grant, still convinced that he had been right and that history would eventually vindicate him. The jury worked through the evidence systematically. They reviewed video footage, looked at transcripts of Derek's online posts, and discussed the testimony they had heard. Some jurors had military backgrounds and spoke about the seriousness of threatening a general officer. Others came from civilian law enforcement families and felt betrayed by Derek's abuse of his position. The foreman, a woman named Claire Hughes who had served on a colony world for 20 years before returning to Earth, kept the deliberations focused and organized. By 6 p.m, the jury had reached preliminary consensus on most charges but wanted to review certain evidence one more time to be absolutely certain. By 8 they were ready. Judge Barnes was notified that the jury had reached a verdict after only 4 hours of deliberation. The speed suggested a clear consensus, which could mean either overwhelming evidence of guilt or a fundamental flaw in the prosecution's case, though everyone involved suspected which it would be. The courtroom was reassembled with remarkable speed, every seat filling within minutes as word spread that a verdict had been reached. Derek was brought back from the holding cells, his expression one of forced confidence that didn't quite hide his nervousness. Linda Grant sat beside him looking exhausted, knowing that 4 hours was not enough time for the jury to have found reasonable doubt. Commander Price and his team sat at the prosecution table, professionally composed but unable to completely suppress their anticipation. Judge Barnes entered and called the court to order. The jury filed in and took their seats, their faces carefully neutral as they had been instructed. Barnes asked if the jury had reached a verdict and Claire Hughes stood as the foreman. She confirmed that yes, they had reached verdicts on all charges. The court clerk accepted the written verdict forms and handed them to Judge Barnes, who reviewed them silently before handing them back to be read aloud. The moment stretched out, tension building in the silent courtroom, as everyone waited to hear the words that would determine Derek's fate. The clerk read in a clear voice that on the charge of assault with a deadly weapon on a military officer, the jury found the defendant Derek Hayes guilty. On the charge of attempted murder, guilty. On the charge of threatening an interstellar peace officer, guilty. On violations of the Unified Earth Criminal Code, guilty. Derek's face went pale as each verdict was read, the reality of his situation finally breaking through his delusions of righteousness. Linda Grant placed a hand on his arm, whether to steady him or to prevent him from saying something that would make things worse. Commander Price allowed himself a small nod. Justice achieved through evidence and law, rather than emotion or revenge. Judge Barnes polled the jury individually to confirm the verdict, each juror standing and affirming their agreement with the findings. All 12 jurors had voted to convict on every charge. Barnes thanked the jury for their service and explained that they would be excused before sentencing, which would be scheduled after a present-tensing investigation. He remanded Derek to federal custody without bail, noting that the convictions and evidence of extremist views made him both a flight risk and a potential danger to others. As guards prepared to take Derek away, he finally spoke, claiming loudly that this was a miscarriage of justice and that he had only been trying to protect people. Judge Barnes ordered him removed from the courtroom, and Derek's voice faded as he was led through the back door toward the cells. That would be his home until sentencing, General. Monroe sat in the gallery and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known she was holding. The justice system had worked, the evidence had been heard, and a unanimous jury of citizens had reached the right conclusion. Admiral Foster squeezed her hand in silent support while Colonel Peterson nodded with satisfaction. Outside the courthouse, news crews broadcast the verdict to billions of people across human space. 2 weeks after the verdict, the courtroom assembled once again for sentencing. Derek Hayes sat at the defense table wearing the same suit he had worn throughout the trial, but now there were no delusions of acquittal to sustain him. The guilty verdicts had broken something in his facade of confidence, though his underlying anger and resentment remained visible in his posture and expression. Linda Grant had met with him several times to discuss the sentencing hearing, and had tried to convince him to express remorse, to acknowledge the harm he had caused, but Derek refused. In his mind, he was still the victim of a corrupt system, still the one who had been trying to do the right thing. Linda knew this attitude would cost him dearly when Judge Barnes imposed sentence. The pre-sentencing investigation report had been filed with the court, a comprehensive document that examined Derek's background, his criminal history, his mental state, and the impact of his crimes. The report recommended severe punishment, noting that Derek showed no remorse, that he remained a danger to society, and that the nature of his crimes warranted the maximum sentences allowed under law. Commander Alan Price had filed additional memoranda arguing for consecutive rather than concurrent sentences, emphasizing the multiple distinct harms Derek had caused and the need to send a clear message that such behavior would face the harshest consequences. Judge Colonel Barnes opened the sentencing hearing by explaining the process. He noted that before imposing sentence, the court would hear from victims who wished to speak about the impact of Derek's crimes. The prosecution had arranged for several witnesses to deliver victim impact statements, and Barnes stressed that Derek should listen carefully to what these people had to say. The first to speak was General Patricia Monroe herself. She approached the podium in her dress uniform, her bearing military perfect but her eyes showing the emotional weight of what she was about to say. Monroe spoke about the moment Derek pointed his weapon at her chest. She described feeling fear not just for her own life, but for the lives of everyone around her, knowing that if Derek fired, the bullet might pass through her and strike one of the many innocent people standing nearby. She talked about the funeral they had been attending, the sacred duty to honor Lieutenant General Marcus Webb, a man who had given everything for humanity and its allies. Monroe explained that Marcus had been her mentor and friend, that his funeral should have been a moment of dignity and respect, and that Derek had desecrated that moment with his hatred and violence. She spoke about the nightmares she had experienced since the incident, the way she sometimes relived those 4 minutes when her life had hung on the decision of an angry man with his finger on a trigger. General Monroe's voice strengthened as she shifted from personal impact to broader consequences. She explained that Derek's actions had damaged Earth's reputation among allied species, that the Valorian ambassador and others had questioned whether humans were ready for their role in galactic leadership. She noted that she had spent hours in diplomatic meetings trying to reassure alien governments that Derek was an aberration, not a representation of human values. Monroe concluded by saying that Derek had not only threatened her life, but had also endangered everything that Marcus Webb had died to protect. She asked Judge Barnes to impose a sentence that would reflect the seriousness of these crimes and would demonstrate to the galaxy that humanity would not tolerate such behavior. Admiral Karen Foster spoke next, describing her experience of being stopped by Derek and subjected to his harassment before he escalated to drawing his weapon. She talked about the 17 other officers and officials in the convoy who had witnessed Derek's behavior, many of whom were young service members who looked up to her as a role model. Foster explained that Derek had tried to humiliate her in front of her subordinates, had questioned her authority and fitness for command based on nothing but his own prejudice. She spoke about the damage such incidents did to morale and unit cohesion, about the message it sent when someone in authority abused that authority to demean others. Admiral Foster asked the court to consider not just the immediate crime, but the pattern of behavior that Derek had exhibited over years, the countless people he had harassed and intimidated while wearing a badge. Colonel James Peterson took the podium and spoke about his friendship with Marcus Webb, about the battles they had fought together, and the principles Marcus had lived by. Peterson described Marcus as someone who believed in bringing people together, who had commanded soldiers from a dozen different human cultures and 3 alien species, and who had never tolerated prejudice or hatred in his ranks. He said that Derek's actions at Marcus's funeral were a betrayal of everything the general had stood for. Peterson noted that he had faced enemy fire many times in his military career, but had never expected to see a police officer draw a weapon on a general at a funeral. He spoke about the fear he had felt watching Derek's finger on the trigger, knowing that one twitch could end General Monroe's life and trigger an incident that might damage Earth's alliances. The prosecution called Dr. Sophie Martinez, the Valorian anthropologist who had witnessed the incident. Dr. Martinez testified through a translator device that converted her crystalline chiming into English words. She explained that in Valorian culture, funeral ceremonies were among the most sacred events, moments when the living honored the dead and reaffirmed their commitment to the values the deceased had represented. She said that threatening violence at such a ceremony was considered one of the gravest possible offenses in her species' moral framework. Dr. Martinez spoke about how deeply the Valorian people had respected Marcus Webb, how they had mourned his death as they would mourn one of their own heroes. She described watching Derek draw his weapon and feeling not just fear, but profound sadness that humans could dishonor their own hero in such a manner. Her testimony was emotional and powerful, her alien perspective making Derek's crimes feel even more shameful. After the victim impact statements concluded, Judge Barnes asked if Derek wished to speak before sentence was imposed. Linda Grant had advised him to offer an apology, to express some understanding of what he had done wrong, but Derek ignored her advice. He stood and addressed the court, his voice defiant as he claimed that he had been trying to do his job, that he had felt threatened, and that the trial had been unfair from the beginning. Derek insisted that history would vindicate him, that people would eventually see he had been trying to protect humanity from those who were leading it astray. His statement was rambling and incoherent in places, revealing the depth of his delusion. Judge Barnes listened without expression, though those who knew him could see the barely contained anger in his eyes. Judge Barnes began his sentencing remarks by addressing Derek directly. He spoke about the oath Derek had taken when he became a police officer, the promise to serve and protect all citizens regardless of who they were or what they looked like. Barnes noted that Derek had violated that oath repeatedly over years, that the 17 complaints filed against him represented only the documented instances of his misconduct. The judge spoke about the special responsibility that came with wearing a badge and carrying a weapon, the trust that society placed in law enforcement, and how Derek had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way. Barnes emphasized that Derek had not made a momentary mistake but had engaged in a pattern of behavior that culminated in pointing a weapon at a general officer during a state funeral attended by interstellar dignitaries. The judge addressed each conviction separately and explained the sentence he was imposing. For assault with a deadly weapon on a military officer, 50 years imprisonment. For attempted murder, 50 years imprisonment. For threatening an interstellar peace officer, 25 years imprisonment. For violations of the Unified Earth Criminal Code, 25 years imprisonment. Judge Barnes then explained that due to the nature of the crimes and the danger Derek posed to society, These sentences would run consecutively rather than concurrently. He also invoked the Military Defense Act, a law that provided for enhanced sentences when crimes endangered Earth's standing with allied species or threatened interstellar relations. Under that act, Barnes imposed an automatic life sentence without possibility of parole. The judge explained that Derek would serve his sentence at the Luna Maximum Security Facility, a prison built on the moon specifically for the most dangerous criminals. He would never return to Earth. Barnes noted that the facility offered educational and work opportunities, that Derek would be treated humanely according to all applicable laws and treaties, but that he would remain incarcerated for the rest of his natural life. The judge concluded by saying that this sentence reflected the seriousness of Derek's crimes, the need to protect society from his continued danger, and the importance of demonstrating to the galaxy that humanity would hold its own people accountable when they betrayed the values that defined civilized society. Derek's face went white as the full weight of the sentence hit him. Life in prison on the moon, never to see Earth again, never to walk free. For a moment he seemed about to speak, perhaps to protest or plead, but then something broke in him and he simply stood there in silence. The news of Derek Hayes receiving a life sentence spread across human space within minutes of Judge Barnes's pronouncement. News networks interrupted regular programming to announce the verdict. Legal analysts praised the sentence as appropriate given the severity of the crimes, and social media erupted with commentary from billions of citizens. The overwhelming majority of responses expressed satisfaction that justice had been served, that someone who had abused his authority and threatened violence at a sacred ceremony would spend the rest of his life in prison. A small minority of extremists tried to paint Derek as a martyr, but their voices were drowned out by the broader consensus that he had received exactly what he deserved. Within 48 hours of sentencing, Earth's government issued formal apologies to the Valorian Confederacy and every other allied species that had representatives at Marcus Webb's funeral. The Secretary of Interstellar Relations, a diplomat named Catherine Moore, personally met with each ambassador to express humanity's regret that such an incident had occurred. Catherine explained that Derek Hayes represented the worst of humanity's past, that his views were not shared by the vast majority of citizens, and that Earth remained committed to its partnerships with allied species. She emphasized that the swift investigation, fair trial, and severe sentence demonstrated that Earth's institutions were strong enough to hold their own people accountable. Ambassador Kelthris of the Valorian Confederacy accepted the apology with grace. In a public statement translated from his crystalline chiming, he said that while the incident had been deeply disturbing, humanity's response had actually strengthened his species' respect for Earth. Kelthris noted that many civilizations tried to excuse or minimize such behavior when it came from their own people, but humanity had instead conducted a thorough investigation and imposed appropriate punishment. He said that Marcus Webb would have been proud to see how his fellow humans had honored his memory by refusing to tolerate the hatred that Derek represented. Other alien ambassadors echoed similar sentiments, expressing that their faith in humanity had been tested but ultimately reinforced by the outcome. General Patricia Munro used the incident as a catalyst for change. She announced the creation of the Marcus Webb Memorial Initiative, a comprehensive program designed to improve law enforcement training and accountability across all human territories. The initiative included mandatory bias awareness training for all police officers, stricter oversight of complaints and misconduct, and the establishment of independent review boards to investigate incidents involving abuse of authority. Munro worked with both military and civilian leadership to develop these reforms, drawing on expertise from across human space, and even consulting with allied species about their own approaches to law enforcement accountability. The initiative also established scholarship programs in Marcus Webb's name, providing educational opportunities for young people from all backgrounds who wanted to pursue careers in military service or law enforcement. Munro believed that the best way to honor Marcus's memory was to build a future where people like Derek Hayes could never rise to positions of authority, where diversity and inclusion were not just ideals, but fundamental values enforced through training and institutional culture. She personally visited police academies and military training facilities across Earth and the colonies, speaking about the incident and what it taught about the responsibilities that came with wearing a uniform and carrying a weapon. Derek's former police department underwent a complete investigation, led by federal authorities, The probe revealed systemic failures in how complaints had been handled, supervisors who had looked the other way, rather than addressing problem officers, and a culture that had allowed Derek and others like him to continue working, despite clear warning signs. The department's chief was forced to resign along with 3 supervisors who had directly enabled Derek's behavior. 7 other officers with similar complaint histories were dismissed or placed under strict probation. The entire department was required to implement the reforms outlined in the Marcus Webb Memorial Initiative, with federal monitors assigned to ensure compliance. Victor Stone, Derek's former supervisor who had testified during the trial, resigned from the police force and became an advocate for law enforcement reform. Racked with guilt over his role in enabling Derek, Victor began speaking publicly about the dangers of institutional complacency and the importance of addressing problem officers before they caused serious harm. He worked with the Marcus Webb Memorial Initiative to develop training programs for supervisors, teaching them how to recognize warning signs of radicalization and how to intervene effectively. Victor's transformation from enabler to advocate became a case study in how individuals could learn from their failures and work to prevent others from making similar mistakes. The trial and its outcome became required study in law enforcement and military academies across human space. Legal scholars wrote articles analyzing the case, examining the intersection of criminal law, military justice, and interstellar relations. The case established important precedents about enhanced sentences for crimes that damaged Earth's standing with allied species, about the special responsibilities of those who carried badges and weapons, and about the limits of claims that stress or fear justified violent actions. Judge Barnes's sentencing remarks were quoted in courtrooms across the colonies, his words about betrayed oaths and violated trust becoming part of the legal canon. In the alien community, humanity's handling of the Derek Hayes case became a reference point for discussions about Earth's fitness for galactic leadership. Species that had been skeptical about human reliability pointed to the incident as evidence of internal problems, but advocates for humanity noted the swift and decisive response. The Valorian Confederacy, which had been closest to Marcus Webb, became one of Earth's strongest defenders in galactic forums. Ambassador Kelthris argued that the true measure of a civilization was not whether it had bad actors, which every species did, but whether its institutions could identify and punish such actors appropriately. By that measure, he said, humanity had proven itself worthy of trust. General Monroe served for another 15 years before retiring with full honors. During her retirement ceremony, she reflected on the Derek Hayes incident in a speech that was broadcast across human space. She said that Derek had represented the worst of what humans could be, someone who had allowed fear and hatred to override duty and decency. But the response to his crimes, she argued, represented the best of humanity, a commitment to justice and accountability even when it was uncomfortable or difficult. Monroe noted that progress was never guaranteed, that every generation had to choose whether to honor the values that made civilization possible or to surrender to the voices of division and hate. She urged her audience to remember Marcus Webb not as a victim of Derek's violence, but as an example of what humans could achieve when they worked together across all differences. Derek Hayes spent his remaining years in the Luna Maximum Security Facility, a solitary figure who never accepted responsibility for his actions. He participated in some of the educational programs offered at the facility, but used them primarily to try to recruit others to his extremist views. Prison authorities monitored his communications and prevented him from spreading his ideology beyond the facility's walls. Other inmates mostly avoided him, recognizing that his crimes had brought shame not just on himself but on all of humanity. Derek died in prison at age 63, having spent over 30 years in lunar confinement, never once expressing genuine remorse for pointing a weapon at General Monroe or for desecrating Marcus Webb's funeral. His death received minimal news coverage, a brief mention noting that the man who had threatened a general at a funeral had died in prison. There were no vigils for Derek Hayes, no one who claimed his legacy as honorable or worthy of remembrance. He had bet everything on the idea that history would vindicate him, that future generations would see him as a hero who stood against corruption, but history instead recorded him as a cautionary tale. Law enforcement instructors showed his trial footage to new recruits as an example of how prejudice and extremism could destroy a career and a life. His name became synonymous with the abuse of authority and the consequences of hatred. The Marcus Webb Memorial continued to grow long after Monroe's retirement. New classes of officers graduated with training that emphasized service to all citizens, accountability for misconduct, and the importance of recognizing and rejecting extremist influences. The scholarship programs funded thousands of young people pursuing careers in service, many of them speaking about how Marcus Webb's example had inspired them to give back to their communities. Statues of Webb were erected on 3 colony worlds where he had served, each one showing him not in battle but in contemplation, representing his belief that the hardest work of leadership was building unity rather than winning fights. In the Valorian Confederacy, Marcus Webb was honored as a hero of their people as well as his own. Valorian children learned about the human general who had fought beside their ancestors at Proxima Station, who had valued all lives equally regardless of species or origin.